Hi, Michael Young here again this week. I'm standing outside the National Library of Australia in Canberra, which is where I'm located. Certainly this time of year what we're seeing is the weather's cooling down, leaves are starting to drop, and we're now starting to get our first frosts. This week what I wanted to do was talk about when you need to start to diversify and make changes to your product and service offerings. One of the things we find in small businesses is that quite often we start out with this idea where we've got a particular skill or product or service that we're going to offer. More often than not, it's based upon our background and our technical expertise. So for those of us that are working as designers, we might stick with design. Those of us that are working as energy efficiency, thermal performance assessors, we might stick with that, and so on. But what we find sometimes is that the market itself may not be big enough, and we may find that if we just do that one thing, we may not generate enough revenue or have enough income to actually pay all the bills that we have to pay. And so we may be forced to diversify, or we may choose to actually change direction or make a pivot in our business to actually move into some other area. Now, this is all completely normal and makes perfect sense. It's not something to be concerned about or ashamed of or whatever, but generally what we find is that as you run a business, as you get to learn about the customers, understand the customers' needs and the problems that they have and how you solve them, what you can start to see is opportunities that start presenting themselves. You'll start to see that your customer, if you're doing say just design work, you'll find that your customer will start coming to you asking, oh, do you also do this, or can you do that for me, or what other functions or services can you provide? And so you'll start to see that your business will evolve and start to change direction over time, and that's completely fine. Quite often what we find is that when we start out, we have this sort of optimistic view as to how quickly the business will grow, how much revenue will generate, how much work we'll do, and more often than not, it takes substantially longer to get to those estimates than we first think it will take. There's also a significant advantage to actually generating and developing a number of products and services. One of the problems we see in small business is quite often they operate what's called an oops business. It's only one product or service, or oops. And the thing with only one product or service is that if you're solving a very discrete problem for a client, then that might be great. But if the market's not big enough, then you're never going to generate enough revenue to pay the bills. Also, what you find is that if you think about it from a customer's perspective, when they first come to you, they've got a particular problem that they need solved, and they come to you to help solve that particular problem. Once they've solved that problem, they then have another problem, and that may well be that it may be related to the first problem, or might be something quite different. And so for us, for example, we do a lot of work teaching and training NatHERS assessors and energy efficiency and thermal performance assessors, and what we found is that the first problem they had was that they needed to get a certificate to become accredited under the current regime, and so we provided training and qualification to do that. What then becomes a problem is that if they don't have any background or experience, they then need a place to be able to network and ask questions and answers, and they also need some help. And so what we've done is we've put in place, in partnership with another organisation, a mentoring program, and so there's that one-on-one arrangement. But we've also created a closed Facebook community whereby all of the assessors can network and ask each other questions, get up-to-date information of what's going on in the industry and so on. And so that's great. Once you've then completed your training, you're up and running as a small business, the next problem you have is how do you actually operate and run a small business? How do you generate revenue? How do you make sales? And how do you become profitable? And so that's the next problem that particular audience has. And so that's the reason we've started these video and blog posts, and there'll be more coming in the future in this space. And so what we tend to see is that as the customer moves through their journey, we find that the problem they start with gets solved from our first product or service. We then need to develop a new product or service to solve the next problem, and so on and so forth. The other added problem with a one product or service type offering is that when it comes to finding a new customer, there's a substantial amount of time and cost involved in acquiring a new customer. That sales process is very expensive in terms of cost, but also expensive in terms of time. And so what we particularly want to do is to look at how we can have the customer come back for follow-on products or services, because once they're a customer, it's far easier to convert a customer to the next product or service, and it's far less costly to convert to that next product or service than to go out and find a brand new customer. And so what we effectively do is get to the point of creating a product ecosystem, which I think I've spoken about or written about in a previous blog post. So that's all for me for this week. As I said, what we want to do is to make sure that we're not an oops business, that we actually have more than one product or service, and we get to a point where we may need to expand our offering or even make a change or pivot in what we deliver, and more often than that, that comes from our own experience, both good, bad and indifferent, but also as we become knowledgeable, we get to know customers and we understand what their needs are and what their problems are that we solve. We can adjust our business and make tweaks and changes to our business to make sure we're delivering exactly what it is that the customer wants and is prepared to pay for. So that's all for me. Any questions or comments, post them. We'll get back to you, and if there's any particular topics you'd like me to talk about, please get in touch and let me know, and we'll cover that in a future video. So all the best, and we'll talk to you next week.